Cancora, let us be very clear. Hamas breached international law on the 7th of October. Hamas targeted innocent civilians in the most callous and inhumane manner, and their actions have been rightly condemned by right-thinking people across the world. But we should also be very clear. Israel has breached international law, not just on every day since October the 7th, but virtually every single day for decades. Israel occupies Palestinian land against international law. Israel blockades Palestinian territory against international law. Israel builds and expands illegal settlements against international law. Israel enforces an apartheid system that restricts the movements of Palestinians and denies their fundamental rights against international law.
Hi there. Welcome back to the show. We're going to be talking about Israel and Palestine today on the program, so I don't really feel like being goofy or silly. I'm not going to play the typical opening music. Probably not going to do a lot of jokes on this episode. This will probably have a pretty different tone than anything else that I've put out on this YouTube channel so far. It's going to be a lot of me just talking. I was going to do this as a podcast episode initially. I was sort of organizing my thoughts into bullet points that I was just going to kind of freestyle talk about. But that felt lacking, I suppose. It felt like this issue was going to require more focus and specificity and effort on my part. So I spent the last week and change writing and rewriting this very, very long script that I'm going to read at you now. So here we go. I don't want to talk about this, or I guess what's more accurate is that I'm honestly really scared to talk about this because I think I feel like no matter how carefully I try to choose my words, I am not going to get through this without a significant portion of people finding something to be very mad at me about. I know it seems like I'm one of those voices on the internet that always has something to say about everything, that always has a hot take. So why wouldn't I have one now? Fair question. Typically, when I use my platform and my voice to talk about something, it's for one of several reasons. It could be that it's an issue that I have a personal proximity to that gives me a unique understanding of it. It could be that it's an issue I've spent a lot of time researching and thinking about, and I feel like I have a way into arguing for a position that I think is novel or interesting or useful. Usually when I talk about something, I have a perspective and an opinion that I am reasonably confident in. I feel like I can defend my position well and eloquently express all the reasons why I hold that position and believe it to be correct. But this issue is something I've never really felt fully comfortable talking about publicly. And lately I'm trying to understand why that is. I've been racking my brain trying to understand my hesitancy and my fear around talking about this. You see, the thing is, I'm kind of obsessed with defending my worldview and speaking in a way that ensures the listener the best possible chance of understanding me. I have a hard time staying out of my own comment section because being misinterpreted or misunderstood by other people causes me a great deal of existential torment. That's kind of embarrassing, but it's the truth. I spend so much time carefully choosing and crafting my words, and the idea that someone could still extract an interpretation of them that is often the exact opposite of what I intended is a really hard thing for me to accept. I always think that if I can just be clear enough, precise enough, thorough enough, that I'll be able to ensure that any possible wrong interpretations of my words will be eliminated for anyone willing to truly listen in good faith. But the reality is, that's not how communication works. I'm trying to control variables I can't possibly control. The listener is having their own emotional experience as a fully formed person with their own entire life story that is informing how they receive and interpret my message. And that is something that will always make being perfectly understood by everyone completely impossible. All that being said, I'm still going to give it my best damn shot. Fair warning before we really get going here, if you are a person who has been personally affected by the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, who either is actively a part of it or who has close friends or family members actively wrapped up in it, who has maybe lost someone close to you or several people close to you in the fighting, this video might not be for you. You have an emotional proximity to the conflict that makes your perspective on it fundamentally different from my own. I can try my absolute hardest, but I'm not confident that I will ever be able to find the right words to adequately relate to your pain and your experience. You're of course free to watch this video if you would like, but I completely understand if you're not the slightest bit interested in the philosophical musings of a white ex-Mormon guy from Utah and would rather skip this one. So okay, here it goes. I'd like to begin with some opening statements on my essential positions and beliefs so as to eliminate any confusion on where I stand personally at this moment in time. I am unequivocally and entirely without exception against genocide, apartheid, Zionism, terrorism, ethnic cleansing, racism, colonialism, imperialism, war, and war crimes, and I stand in firm support of all the innocent people who are caught in the crosshairs of powerful forces that like to use them as pawns in this geopolitical power struggle. I am not a supporter of the Israeli government and their decades-long US-backed Zionistic occupation of Palestinian lands and their subsequent subjugation, dehumanization, and slaughter of Palestinian people. I am also not a supporter of the genocidal idea that Jews should be exterminated and that innocent people should be killed in the name of achieving retributive justice for the unconscionable actions of the Israeli government. And that's, in a nutshell, kind of it from me. That's a pretty solid summation of my foundational position on this situation. That's the Austin Archer hot take on Israel and Palestine. Hope it was everything you always wanted it to be. I don't think it's particularly hard to say any of that stuff that I just said. I don't think anything I just said actually qualifies as a hot take. It's not new. It doesn't add anything fresh or groundbreaking to the conversation. In fact, I'd say 99% of the posts I see about this topic more or less agree with everything I just said. It's pretty hard to find a person posting on social media who is willing to represent themselves as being openly pro-genocide or pro-ethnic cleansing. At least on my page, it is, and with my algorithmic preferences. Your feed may differ, but most of the people I see using their voices to bring awareness to this conflict seem to primarily care more about the innocent lives of civilians trapped in the crossfire than they do about the goals and objectives of either side's militarized forces. Quick side note here, when I talk about militarized forces in this video, I'm talking specifically about armed forces that have engaged in pursuing goals through violent force. I understand that Israel has an actual state military that is extremely well funded and significantly more structurally powerful than any guerrilla factions of Palestinian freedom fighters. I am not making an equivocation between the military might of these two forces, just referring to any faction that has resorted to using warlike tactics in this conflict. Back to what I was saying. So, if we all more or less feel this way, why does it feel like we're constantly at each other's throats over this? Why is this so difficult to talk about? If we all seemingly agree, why is there so much vitriol and heated accusations being thrown around? I see people getting death threats and really abrasive comments and DMs criticizing their stances that seem, to me at least, to be pretty reasonable and relatively tame. As I've mentioned before, I'm really uncomfortable personally talking about this for multiple reasons, but one is definitely because I don't trust how people are going to react to and interpret whatever it is I choose to say. And maybe that sounds like kind of a chicken shit position, like I'm scared certain people won't like me anymore if they don't like how I choose to talk about Israel and Palestine. But that's also kind of an oversimplification of what's giving me pause. It's not just the fear of being misunderstood or disliked. Every time I post anything on the internet, there are people who find a reason to be mad at me for it. Like, literally every time, no matter how seemingly innocuous the subject matter of the post is. I mean, I just made a whole video on TikTok about a commenter who was baffled and bewildered at the sight of me wearing a baseball cap indoors. Seriously, it was a whole thing. But with this particular issue, it just feels different. It feels like the anger and vitriol is all turned up to 11. It feels like the stakes to get it right and to be heard publicly getting it right are incredibly high. And I guess I'm just wondering, like, is that particularly helpful and is it necessary? And those are genuine questions that I don't know the answers to. I totally get that it could sound like I'm tone policing here. It's just, it feels like we're all more or less agreeing and saying some version of the same things while screaming at each other about the minutest details of the language we use to more or less agree and say the same things. And that feels weird and confusing and anxiety-inducing to me. Like, I get that details in language matter, but it just feels like the hyperbole around this topic in the online space is particularly charged in a way that seems less than productive. And so this is what I would like to really talk about in this video. More than giving you just another white American man's piping hot take on how you should feel about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I want to talk about how we are conducting ourselves in the online discourse around this topic. How we are participating in this conversation. And when I say we in this context, I'm referring primarily to Americans, Canadians, people from the UK, the people who I'm primarily seeing and interacting with online, people from primarily English-speaking countries who are not directly involved with the conflict in any real, material, tangible way. And what I mean by that is that the conflict is not literally on our doorstep. I understand that the American government has heavily supported Israel for decades and continues to work with Israel even now in addressing this latest campaign from Hamas. But if we're going to say that we need to separate people from their governments, let's be intellectually consistent about that and be willing to separate civilian Americans from their government as well. My government has historically supported Israel, yes, but I personally have never tangibly, physically been involved with the Israel-Palestine conflict in any significantly personal way. And I don't really know anyone who has. And so these are the people who I'm going to be addressing in this video. These are the people who I'm talking about and to when I say we. People who themselves have no immediate, personal, close, intimate connection with this conflict, but who are, nonetheless, engaged in passionate, heated online discourse regarding it. Again, if you are a person who has been personally affected by or involved in this conflict and you are choosing to watch this video, this is your reminder that I am not talking about you. I am talking to and about those of us on the outside looking in, those of us whose only real exposure to this conflict has been through a screen. So the first problem that I'm seeing with the way we're conducting ourselves when discussing and posting about this topic is the hyperbolic and extremely uncharitable ways we are choosing to interpret each other's words. Look, I understand that bad actors on the internet frequently engage in disingenuous doublespeak, saying one thing but meaning another, and that people are always on the lookout for codes and dog whistles, particularly in discussions involving racial tensions and tensions between historically oppressed and marginalized people. That is to say, I get that you can't just take everyone at face value. But sometimes in our online discourse, it feels like we aren't willing to take anyone at face value when they speak up about this conflict. It can often feel like we go out of our way to read between the lines and find the worst possible interpretation of each other's words. For instance, I'll see a post from a Jewish friend who might say something like, "Seeing a lot of genocidal rhetoric being directed toward Jewish people, I fear for the safety and well-being of Jewish people around the world, and I fear that I am going to witness another genocide against Jewish people in my lifetime. And at the same time, I feel immense empathy and compassion for the Palestinians who have suffered horrific injustices at the hands of the Israeli government for decades. I acknowledge their pain and suffering, and I want it to end." Check the comments on a post like that, and you're sure to find someone passionately accusing them of being a Zionist, or at the very least, a Zionist sympathizer or apologist. They didn't explicitly espouse Zionist ideology or explicitly engage in Zionist apologia, but they talked about the suffering of Jewish people first and Palestinian people second. They prioritized their own fear and pain before acknowledging the fear and pain of others. And because of that, there will probably be people doing deep dives into their specific language, trying to do comment section detective work to find the hidden interpretation that makes the poster look as bad as possible. In another instance, you might see a post from someone saying something to the effect of, "We need to separate the Israeli people from the actions of the Israeli government, just as we should separate the Palestinian people from the actions of Hamas. I do not agree with the killing of innocent Israeli civilians, and at the same time, I wholeheartedly condemn the decades of Zionistic occupation and apartheid the Israeli government has been imposing on the Palestinians. The only way this ends is if Israel ends their unjust occupation of Palestinian land. Free Palestine." Go to the comments on that post, and you're bound to find more than a few people passionately accusing the poster of being straight up anti-Semitic, accusing the poster of supporting the killing of innocent Israeli people by Hamas, coming to these conclusions by diagnosing the perceived subtext in their phrasing, essentially refusing to accept that there could be a good faith distinction being made between being pro-Palestine and pro-Hamas, or a distinction between being anti-Israeli government and full-blown anti-Semitic. The third kind of posts that I see getting supercharged negativity are the kind of posts I've been making about this topic, the absent ones. This YouTube video is the first real thing I've ever publicly said about this conflict that's been going on since before I was alive. In the wake of recent events, I have not posted on Instagram, Threads, X, or TikTok about it yet. And the responses I see range from people simply asking when I'm going to say something, to people calling me a mealy-mouthed liberal hypocrite, a coward, and accusing me of being complicit in the suffering of innocent people, saying I'm not using my voice or my platform in a responsible way. I'm not an active part of the solution, so I am therefore an active part of the problem. I am a problem. I am the problem. And I have to say, I completely get why this happens. People are afraid. We're confused. We feel a deep and profound sense of helplessness, and we are looking for someone, anyone, to direct all of those intense emotions at. We're trying our best to make sense of a situation with so much violence that feels entirely senseless. We often don't have access to the people we would like to direct our anger and frustration at, so we take it out on each other instead. We attack each other. We accuse each other. We blame each other. I want to be really clear. I'm not judging here. I'm just reporting and commenting on my subjective experience of witnessing these patterns and behaviors online. I completely understand why some Jewish people would be on high alert in a situation that has sparked a resurgence in worldwide full-throated anti-Semitism. I get how in a situation like this, a Jewish person might be skeptical and defensive listening to an opinion from a person who feels the need to qualify what they're saying with assurances that it is not anti-Semitic. Like, you can say, I promise my position is not rooted in anti-Semitism all you want. It's just, that's kind of the sort of thing that an anti-Semite would say right before saying something extremely anti-Semitic. Modern white supremacist and Christian nationalist anti-Semites use coded language and dog whistles all the time to buy themselves plausible deniability. They can claim that they didn't say anything explicitly anti-Semitic while covertly pushing messages that are drenched in anti-Semitic tropes, undertones, and implications. And the reality here is, while you may be making drawing a sincere distinction between criticism for the Israeli government and criticism for the Israeli people, many actual anti-Semites are not interested in making that distinction and would like to use the bad actions of the Israeli government as a catalyst to gin up anti-Semitic sentiment and to promote violence against Jewish people across the globe. So it's not like these concerns and fears from Western Jewish people on your timeline are entirely unfounded or just hyper-emotional overreactions. Likewise, I can fully understand and sympathize with the mindset that anything other than full allegiance and solidarity with Palestine is simply not good enough. There are a lot of people who look at the maps of disappearing Palestinian land over this decades-long occupation. They look at the charts showing the massive disparity in the death toll between Israelis and Palestinians. They listen to the voices of Palestinians describing their treatment at the hands of the Israeli military. And after synthesizing all of that data, they come to the conclusion that being unapologetically pro-Palestine is the only conscionable position to take. It's a more than reasonable and highly humanistic conclusion to come to. But it is a conclusion that directly informs my second problem with the way we are conducting ourselves in the online discourse of this conflict, and that is the insistence on picking a team and throwing your full weight behind that team. There's a disconnect here in what everyone seems to be saying that's really confusing for me. If we all more or less have the same core feelings, that genocide is bad, that war is bad, that death and dehumanization of innocent civilians is bad, regardless of who is doing it, that we should not conflate people with their governments or hold people accountable for the actions of their governments, that we essentially just want to end the bloodshed and for some form of functional peace to be achieved, if we all basically agree on those fundamental things, then why does it so often feel like there is a subtle, but also not really subtle at all, pressure to definitively pick a side and root for that side publicly? I see a lot of people saying things and espousing basic beliefs that would seem to suggest they aren't specifically taking sides with either of the militarized forces in the conflict. That is to say, they are not rooting for a victory for either faction that is achieved through militaristic, violent force. It's very common to see people condemning violent tactics on both sides while expressing support and sympathy for the innocent victims, both Israeli and Palestinian, who are tragically caught in the crossfire. And yet, there is this inescapable feeling that when you make a public statement of opinion on this topic, you are expected to subtly or not so subtly declare your support in the direction of one team over the other. You should say all the things I said before, yes, that you don't support violence from anyone, that you don't support war crimes, genocide, ethnic cleansing, etc., all that bad stuff from anyone, that you sympathize and stand in solidarity with all of the victims, that you don't hold people accountable for the actions of their government. But once you've said all that, people seemingly still want to know, are you a little more Team Israel or are you a little more Team Palestine? And before I move on in this section, I need to acknowledge something that feels like an elephant in the room of this discussion. It's something many of you have maybe been itching for me to say. I touched on this briefly at the beginning of this video when I was defining my contextual usage of the term militarized forces. But to get into it a little deeper, here's a clip of deceased Jewish political commentator Michael Brooks speaking on this conflict in 2018.
Are you not concerned about the binary between either condemning Israel entirely, being like also a stance that a lot of like very strong and notorious anti-Semitic people agree with, versus like, you know, seeing this as more of a complex issue where it is wrong what's going on and that there's also a way to do this, that Israel still exists and is supported?
So it's not a complex issue. That's the big thing. It's super simple. There's one group that has enormous power. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States. It acts on another population of people with total impunity and is never held accountable for anything. So there's no symmetry in the relationship, period. And just as like a thought experiment, IDW people, if we know that if somehow a population of Jewish refugees ended up in West Bank and Gaza, and an Arabic government in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv had an open-air prison in what, Jewish Gaza, which they bombed with white phosphorus. They killed civilians indiscriminately, and they had no provisions for medicine. They had an embargo that blocked food, that electricity wasn't running, that there was an over 48% unemployment rate. Life expectancy and malnutrition statistics were horrifying. One of the major policymakers in this hypothetical Arabic Palestinian state said, we need to put those Jews on a diet. In the West Bank, there was another Jewish area where there was a little bit more autonomy, but there was regular Arabic settlements where they pulled up the Jewish farmers' foods, they terrorized them with rocks, the security forces broke children's bones, and they couldn't drive their own roads. We'd all have no problem understanding what that was.
So I agree wholeheartedly with pretty much everything that Michael Brooks says here. He's spot on about the asymmetrical relationship between the two central factions at the center of this conflict. He's spot on that there is no good faith equivocation that can be made between the actions and behaviors of the Israeli government and those of Palestinian freedom fighters. Israel is an extremely well-funded, extremely powerful, internationally recognized country with the full backing and support of one of the most powerful military forces in the history of the world, the good old USA. Israel has been engaged for over half a century in an unjust occupation of Palestinian land and carrying out a decades-long genocide, racial apartheid, and ethnic cleansing of Palestinian people. The reason why we need to talk about this in the section of the video where we are talking about the pressure to pick a team is because I think this is what informs a lot of people's inclination to pick a team. When weighing the historical evidence, the body count, the disappearing land, the many injustices, it's clear that historically the Israeli government has inflicted significantly more damage to the Palestinian people than the other way around. It's clear that to align with Palestinian freedom fighters is to align with the underdogs, the oppressed, the team that has been more heavily brutalized and victimized by this conflict. And that feels right for a lot of people. That feels clear and simple and correct. But that's where Michael Brooks and I disagree. I think he's right about everything he said in that video, except for this.
So it's not a complex issue. That's the big thing. It's super simple.
This concept that this issue is simple and not complex is something you see a lot of in online discourse. It's also what informs the confidence many people have in picking a team to root for. The feeling that there is a clear-cut and simple narrative, a clear group of bad guys and a clear group of good guys. People tend to get extremely upset if you even suggest that the issue is complex and not simple, that there might be more nuance to consider and weigh. And I think I understand where that comes from. I mean, first of all, I think labeling the issue as being complex has historically been a tactic used to dismiss the conflict or get out of having to think or talk about it in any substantive way.
I don't have to know every single fucking nuanced thing about this complex issue. It's not fucking complex. It's really fucking simple. You're using that as a tool to intellectually dominate me. You're bullying me so that I don't talk about this shit. You don't want anyone to talk about this shit at all.
So I totally agree with and empathize with the sentiment of what my friend Violet is saying here. There are a lot of people who have a valid feeling that calling the conflict complex and not simple is a way to essentially encourage silence, to tell people not to speak up and not to share vital information because there's more context that they're not aware of, and the reality of the situation is far too complex for anyone to fully understand properly. And I don't think that's just a paranoid belief. I think there are groups that have historically propagandized the idea of the conflict being too complex for anyone to fully understand in order to specifically discourage anyone from fully engaging with it intellectually or emotionally. I also think that fundamentally what so many people are seeking when they engage with this conflict is a feeling of safety. This conflict makes people feel profoundly unsafe and insecure. The suggestion of complexity provokes a feeling that a solution would be very complex and hard to find, which means that more violence and bloodshed will continue to happen, which means that the feeling of being unsafe intensifies. Conversely, the suggestion of simplicity is cleaner and more manageable. A simple problem has a simple solution, and a simple obtainable solution offers a feeling of safety and hope. So I get why someone saying that it's complex and not simple is triggering for many reasons. I get how and why that often feels like someone is trying to shut down or discourage the sharing of information and the process of critical thinking. And I get how it can lead to a deeply unpleasant sensation of being unsafe. But when I say that this issue is definitely complex and not simple, I'm not saying that both sides are just as bad as each other or that you shouldn't engage with the topic because it's too complicated to fully grasp. I acknowledge the lopsided nature of the two sides in this conflict. I've already spelled that out very clearly. I definitely think that despite its complexity, people should still do their very best to engage with it and understand it, to not look away from it, to not simply pretend it isn't happening just because it seems so daunting and hard to untangle, but also to not label a conflict that has been raging on for a half century as simple and easy to solve just because that feels emotionally safer. Let me try my best to explain. I think given the objective fact that this conflict has been so obviously lopsided, the inclination to unequivocally side with and throw your support behind Palestine makes sense. I completely understand that impulse. Here's where it begins to get a little complicated for me.
We're with the Palestinian resistance 100%. No ifs, no ands, no buts, no equivocations, no apologies, no condemnations. We don't need to go any further than that, right? Some people want to criticize the table manners of a starving person. You don't criticize the table manners of a starving person. You let them eat, right? You want to talk about, well, they shouldn't be doing things this way or they should be doing things that way. All right, get your boot off my neck and then we'll talk. Right? It's like this occupation has been going on for however many years. Stop the occupation and then we'll talk. Then we can talk about table manners. Then we can talk about this tactic and that tactic, right? But what happens is every single time is that we zoom in on the details and we forget about the bigger picture. And that's why we say Palestine has to be free first, period.
Okay, so as I've stated many times already in this video, I fully condemn the Israeli government and their actions throughout the long history of this conflict. I think Palestine deserves to be free and that the Israeli occupation of Palestinian land never should have happened and should end as soon as possible. I find the Palestinian plight to be immensely easy to sympathize with and align with. But when it comes to language like the language in that clip I just played, I have to pause. I support Black Lives Matter in its current form. I support everything Black Lives Matter has historically stood and fought for. I think that BLM's existence is fully warranted and just and good. The mission to fix America's centuries-long struggle with white supremacy, institutional racism, unchecked police brutality, and constant subjugation and dehumanization of all things not white is a good and necessary mission. I believe that people need to take a seat and check their privilege when they criticize the methods that BLM activists use to resist their oppressors. And in America, we get really petty with this stuff. American conservatives will straight up say that quietly kneeling during the national anthem is a step too far in demonstrating your support for racial justice. An act that is entirely peaceful and causes no immediate physical harm to anyone. I think that's ridiculous. I endorse many forms of peaceful and even occasionally not so peaceful resistance. I fully agree with what the man in this clip is saying. I think it's an emotionally resonant and incredibly sympathetic position. You can't criticize someone's table manners if you actively have your boot on their neck. Take your foot off their neck, then you can talk. I live in a country with a bunch of white supremacist, radical conservatives with Blue Lives Matter flags on their cars who always side with the police anytime they kill an unarmed black civilian, no matter how much evidence there is to show that the police were blatantly in the wrong. I have little to no patience when those people get mad about a store window being broken or some property being set on fire. Those actions, to me, pale in comparison to the centuries of egregious injustices America's white supremacist power structure has inflicted on its communities of color. All that being said, the conflict between people fighting for racial justice in America and the racist power structure has not yet escalated to the level that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict has. We don't have guerrilla factions of racial justice activists murdering white people in the name of retributive justice. We don't have active acts of widespread violence being regularly carried out between the two opposing forces. Again, I understand that the military-like and war-like acts of violence in the Israel-Palestine situation are not remotely evenly weighted, just like Black Lives Matter is nowhere near as well-funded or socially powerful as the American police and the capitalistic power structure that backs them. But if we hypothetically lived in a world where racial justice fighters in the US were to start killing innocent white families, and they said they wouldn't stop until America agrees to abolish its police force and rebuild it from the ground up with the aid of an agreed-upon committee in some kind of brokered peace, I don't know. Is my support of racial justice so unequivocal, so 100%, offered with absolutely zero caveats to the point where I will accept and condone any and all behavior in the name of the resistance? While we're in this thought experiment, let's take it a step further and make it personal. Let's say members of my family were killed in one of these guerrilla warfare acts of violent resistance. People from outside the USA would surely take to the internet to discuss their opinions on the situation. Many people would understandably throw their full unconditional support behind the militarized Black Lives Matter resistance forces, citing the immense power disparity in the struggle and the centuries of systematic oppression people of color have endured in America. And they wouldn't necessarily be wrong to do that. The only problem is that does nothing for me and my situation. My family members are still dead. When I engage with this thought experiment emotionally, it doesn't feel like it would be appropriate or correct or particularly simple to tell me in that situation that I am not allowed to be angry, to tell me that because of the historically brutal actions of my government, my family members essentially had it coming, that their deaths don't matter, or at the very least, that their deaths and my pain matter less than the ultimate cause of the resistance fighters who killed them, that their deaths are an acceptable cost to achieve the goal of dismantling America's corrupt systems of power. But as of right now, that scenario is thankfully just a hypothetical. It hasn't actually happened. But in the Israel-Palestine situation, it's not a hypothetical at all. This is kind of exactly what's happening and what's been happening for a very long time. Yes, Israel has racked up a much higher body count, being the much larger, much more powerful force. But for some time now, both groups have been willing to use deadly force, often on innocent people, to further their causes. The freedom fighter in that video I just played says it's not complicated. Back Palestine 100%. No ifs, ands, or buts. But since it's not a hypothetical, I think the question has to be asked. Are there any limits to what an oppressed people can do to achieve liberation and justice? I know that there are a lot of leftists that will simply say without wavering, no. They make it simple and clean. There are no limits. And I get this. It feels right. It feels cleaner and more contained. But there are questions I can't help but ask. What's the end game? How does this eye for an eye, tit for tat, anything goes philosophy ultimately play out? Would everyone who has unequivocally declared themselves to be anti-Israel and pro-Palestine be satisfied if Palestine were able to rack up a body count that equaled Israel's? Would that fix it? If Palestinian freedom fighters were able to carry out violent campaigns that made it so just as many innocent Israelis were killed as innocent Palestinians have been killed, would that fix the conflict? Would that settle the score? Would everyone then see the playing field as being level and equal again? And I understand that that's not necessarily the goal. I understand that some people just view violence as a necessary evil to get oppressive forces to back down, that many people are fully in support of Palestine using any and all methods at their disposal to fight against their oppressors, but only as a means of getting Israel to end its occupation and grant Palestine its freedom. Meaning, these people still have a caveat and a condition to their support of violent force. Basically, you may use violent force even against innocent people, with the understanding that once you get what you want, the bloodshed must stop. Or in other words, once the boot is removed from your neck, you have to stop stabbing the person wearing it in the ankle with your little pocket knife. And that seems like a reasonable enough proposition, right? Full support of oppressed people to resist by any means necessary, but if they achieve liberation, they should cease any and all violent methods and actions and seek to establish peace. But again, I have to go back to the question of, is that realistic? Honestly, ask yourself, is that how that would actually play out? If Palestinian freedom fighters were able to inflict enough violent force on Israelis to convince Israel to back down and discontinue its occupation, would that end the conflict? Many people seem to believe that it would. Many of the people I see on the internet seem to believe that what makes this issue simple and not complicated is the idea that all Israel has to do is end the occupation and grant Palestine its freedom and autonomy. Once they do that, peace will be achieved and the problem will be solved. And again, I get how that is a clean, very appealing, very satisfying narrative. But come on, be honest. Doesn't that feel a little unlikely? Not only that we actually would be able to get a force as powerful as Israel to back down, but also that if we were able to do that, the fighting would end immediately and the region would enjoy its first peace in decades. I mean, what if there were Palestinian freedom fighters who believed that the only way to ensure prolonged peace and safety for their people was to keep pushing and to fully eradicate and exterminate all of Israel and by extension, all Jewish people in the world? What if that became the goal in the name of seeking to oppose oppression? Should our unequivocal support of freedom fighters fighting to prevent their own genocide by any means include the means of committing genocide against the oppressing force and all of the innocent people associated with that force? What if we were able to successfully create enough noise online to encourage and effectively achieve a working ceasefire in the region? Israel ends its aggression and grants Palestine its land and its rights. Let's say in this scenario, all parties involved are genuinely committed to an actual ceasefire and all killing has stopped. What do we do then with all of the Israeli Jews who live in the occupied territory? Do we demand that as part of the ceasefire, they must evacuate, creating an international refugee crisis? Do we try to encourage Palestinians and Israelis to peacefully coexist in the newly freed Palestinian land? Do we really trust that such a scenario could be feasibly achieved? And this is what I'm talking about when I say that this is a complex issue. I'm not just throwing my hands up and saying that there's good and bad on both sides, so who knows? That's not at all what I'm saying. But calling the violence bad and saying you want an end to the killing and you want justice for the Palestinian people, that's relatively simple. Trying to figure out how any of that should be accomplished and the logistics of how it would practically work if it were accomplished is anything but simple. I'm telling you, this shit is fucking heavy. These are not hypotheticals or exaggerations. These are the questions we actually have to consider and weigh. If I am against genocide, then I am against genocide. Period. No exceptions. I'm not just against genocide unless someone can convince me that they have suffered to a degree where they should be allowed to commit genocide as an act of resistance. If I stand firm in the idea that we should make a distinction between people and their governments and that innocent people dying is unjust, no matter who is doing the killing or what the cause for the killing is, then that's a position I need to be intellectually consistent about. I can't say that people shouldn't be held accountable for the actions of their government, but if their government has been particularly evil to a particular group of people, I might look the other way when those people seek revenge by killing them. If I do that, then I'm sort of endorsing the idea that by virtue of being associated with that corrupt government, those people at least kind of deserve whatever ramifications come their way. At this point, you might be thinking, Austin, you're making this way more complex than it needs to be. Simply go on the internet, get on Instagram or Threads or X or TikTok or all of them and say, I condemn the Israeli government and their unjust occupation of Palestinian lands and their subsequent subjugation, dehumanization, and eradication of Palestinian people. I stand with Palestine and believe that Palestinian people should be free. I also believe that the killing of innocent people is wrong, and I condemn the use of deadly force against innocent bystanders in all cases. If you say that, you're covering all your bases. You're condemning the colonialist, Zionist, ultra-powerful group, supporting the historically oppressed and marginalized group, and voicing your caveat that you believe killing innocent people is wrong. You can even throw in a bit about how you're not anti-Semitic and don't support anti-Semitism if you like. How hard is that? Well, kind of surprisingly fucking hard. Actually, I don't feel great telling a group of people that are looking down the barrel of a full-blown genocide, a group of people that have been degraded and oppressed and brutalized for decades, a group of people whose personal suffering is greater than anything I've ever known in my privileged corner of the earth, that they are not allowed to seek their liberation by any means necessary, that my support for them has exceptions and caveats. That doesn't feel awesome. It feels like I should just offer my unequivocal, unapologetic support and let that be it. But if I do that, if I do offer my unequivocal and fully unapologetic support, no exceptions, no caveats, then I am condoning the concept of innocent Israelis being killed to achieve Palestinian liberation. That's just what that means. I'm saying that while I might not prefer it, I will not condemn it and will support it if and when it happens. I will not withdraw my support or offer criticism for any reason or under any circumstance. And that feels not great also. So it's a real quagmire and paradox for my brain. It really is. I don't want to offer people fighting against an oppressive regime conditional support because that feels kind of fucked up and shitty. But I also don't want to unconditionally condone literally any tactic that could be used in the name of fighting that oppression. That feels dangerous and morally irresponsible. I don't want to have to prioritize innocent Israelis or innocent Palestinians when deciding whose pain to sympathize with more. I do not want to publicly weigh whose suffering is more worthy of my support and sympathy. I feel like if innocent people are suffering because they are unfortunate enough to be caught in the middle of a prolonged geopolitical conflict that they do not have any real power over, it makes no sense to decide which of those people get my support a little more and which get my support a little less. They're all victims. They all deserve my sympathy and support equally. And more than anything, I just don't feel like a white ex-Mormon guy from Sandy fucking Utah should be publicly telling anyone anything about this conflict. I don't feel like I should be the one to parse all this out and tell you who to align yourself with. It just fundamentally doesn't feel appropriate. Which brings me to my next problem. The foundational and inescapable ignorance of people like me who are not personally and intimately involved with this conflict in any immediate or significant way.
Some of you have not been speaking up about this, and your silence is deafening. And if you do not know what you are talking about and you aren't affected by it, you should not be speaking up about this. And the fact that you are not speaking up about this terrifies us. And you need to stop speaking about things that you don't know anything about. And if you don't know about this, you need to educate yourself. And now is the time to reach out and ask us questions. But we are not here to educate you. And you need to know these things. And if you do not know these things, you should not be adding your voice to the conversation. And the fact that you are not raising your voices right now terrifies us. Because no matter what you're doing, you're dumb and you fucking suck.
This is tricky because I know that this section could sound like I'm trying to be dismissive or excuse myself from having to take sides because I just don't know enough about it. And I know that the obvious knee-jerk response to hearing someone say something like that would be, well then, fucking learn. Do your research, do your due diligence, do what you have to do to get educated. But when I talk about ignorance here, I'm not just talking about lacking an academic knowledge of the conflict, lacking an accurate historical understanding of all the necessary details and events and storylines around the conflict. Not that learning all that stuff is a simple task. I mean, there is over 50 years of information to consume for anyone who is seeking to become a well-versed scholar on the subject. 50 years of significant moments and events, 50 years of various injustices, 50 years of collaboration and interference from various geopolitical forces outside the region, 50 years of tragedy and death. Anyone wanting to thoroughly do their own research and develop a solid working knowledge of the entire thing would certainly have their work cut out for them. But when I talk about the fundamental and inescapable ignorance that I see in our online discourse, I'm talking more primarily about a fundamental and inescapable form of emotional ignorance. When I choose to talk about and advocate for the queer community, or more specifically for trans liberation, that decision to speak out and use my platform is in no small part informed by the fact that I have many trans and queer friends, that I know their stories and their pain intimately. It's also informed by the fact that I was raised in a religion that was and still is massively prejudiced toward queer people. There is a deep personal sense of shame attached to my advocacy. I am ashamed that I ever held beliefs that were so harmful to so many people who I love, and part of my advocacy is, at least in some part, tied to a psychological desire to karmically atone for those beliefs. In other words, it's profoundly personal for me on an emotional level. The same can be said for many of the causes I consistently add my voice and platform to. I talk about gun control because I have personally lost people close to me to gun violence, because I have nieces and nephews who are afraid to go to school in America, where we have such a tragically common problem with school shootings, because I myself am afraid of being a victim of America's gun problem. When I talk about the need for safe and legal access to abortion, it's because I have close friends who have needed safe and legal access to abortion in their lives. It's because I value bodily autonomy on a personal, emotional level. And it's because I live in a country that is actively engaged in the process of stripping millions of people of their bodily autonomy through anti-abortion legislation. And also because I have a deep personal desire to not live in an authoritarian theocracy. I think you get the point. When it comes to Israel and Palestine, however, I can do everything in my power to become as educated as possible on an academic level, but it feels like for so many of us who are engaging in the online discourse, there will always be a barrier at the emotional and personal level preventing us from ever fully understanding. We can listen to the stories, look at the images, do our best to sympathize and empathize with the people who are directly involved. We can try to imagine the horror of what it must be like for them. But that will only ever take us so far. Going back to my earlier analogy about the Black Lives Matter movement, I publicly advocate for and support that movement because even as a white man, I have firsthand experience with the cruelty and casual abuses of power so often seen from the American police force. I have black friends whose lives I deeply and personally value in a very acute way that is accessible to me in a visceral and immediate sense. I understand my support for this cause in my bones. What I don't fully understand yet is how I might feel if the hypothetical scenario I mentioned earlier were to happen. If Black Lives Matter activists started to form violent militias that carried out coordinated acts of violence that targeted and killed civilians as a means of resisting their systemic oppression, and then if I had family or friends killed in one of those acts of targeted violence, I can only approach an understanding of what that might be like as a thought experiment. I don't actually have any immediate access to what it would really be like and how it would potentially shape and change my worldview. And that's the ignorance that I'm talking about. The ignorance that I feel so many of us are inescapably mired in. A fundamental inability to fully grasp the weight and emotional complexity of this conflict. This is why I say that it can feel inappropriate for me to comment on the conflict. It feels inappropriate to give opinion or commentary or to try to offer analysis on a situation that I am so far removed from on an emotional level, to comment on a form of pain and suffering that I can only try to understand in theory. So what's the proposed solution here? Should those of us who aren't immediately personally affected by this just butt out of it and leave all the talking and advocacy to the people who are personally affected by it? I mean, no, right? At least, I don't think so. I don't think that's what the people involved want us to do. In fact, I think the opposite is true. I think, if anything, there is immense social pressure to speak up and get involved, no matter what your level of personal knowledge or academic expertise on the topic actually is. And that brings me to the last thing I'd like to investigate: the immense social pressure to publicly say something.
Hey everybody, serious video here real quick. Just wanted to give my full-throated and unequivocal support and solidarity to the Palestinian struggle. A lot of you who have been following me for a while, this comes as no surprise. But I have a lot more followers and a lot new followers, and I just wanted to basically make that as clear as possible. Free Palestine. What's happening there is a blatant humanitarian crisis. It's a genocide. It's ethnic cleansing. It's not very complicated to me, but I understand there's a lot of people's families and there's a lot of civilians and there's a lot of emotions wrapped up in this and a lot of history too. So I understand that if it bothers you, if you don't like that, if you want to unfollow, I totally understand. But I want you to take note of how quickly even the most apolitical people were putting BLM in their bio, posting a black square. And when it comes to something like this, it's really silent and no one can really talk about it directly. So I wanted to say that.
I want to make something clear about some of these videos that I'm sharing here, specifically this one and the earlier one from my friend Violet. These are people that I follow. These are people I like and respect. I'm not including these videos to criticize these people, and I certainly don't want to encourage anyone watching this to criticize or judge them. I'm just sharing these videos as a means of contextualizing the general vibe of my current timeline. Those two posts are pretty reflective of the general kind of messaging, the general emotional state, and the general energy I'm getting from a lot of my online friends and people I follow. I don't necessarily disagree with anything that either video said, but you will notice that there exists in both videos a not so subtle pressure being applied to encourage others to speak out. There's an implication that not speaking out makes you a bad person. There are definitive character assessments and judgments being made in each video. There is a strong implication that saying something, anything, is the right thing to do. I understand this sentiment and I'm sympathetic to it. The concept of silence in the face of great injustice being equatable to violence is not new, and it definitely resonates with me. Hey, it's Austin who's editing this video. I had a thought that I wanted to add to this section, so I'm going to do that now, several days later in different clothes in a different part of my apartment. So as I said just there, I don't necessarily disagree with the sentiment that more people should speak up and use their voices to advocate for disenfranchised and marginalized people. I understand the impulse to apply this kind of social pressure. I understand it from an emotional point of view, and I understand the logic behind it. The emotional impulse behind it, I believe, again, is X issue makes me feel unsafe and scared, and more people talking about it, more people problem solving on it, means a higher likelihood of it getting solved and me feeling safe again. It's a way of emotionally or psychologically regaining a little bit of control in a situation that makes you feel very out of control. And the logic behind it is very much the same. More people, more voices talking about a thing, raising awareness for a thing, means a higher likelihood of something being done to address and solve that thing. The problem is, it's sort of an incomplete thought. The way that we propagate this idea in our public discourse is everyone should be talking about this. You should be talking about this. Use your voice and talk about this. We need more people talking about this. which is not untrue, but it's just not the complete thought, because what we actually need in many of these situations is not simply more people talking about this, but more specifically, we need more people who are properly educated on the topic, sharing accurate and useful information on it. But that's not necessarily what we say. That's not necessarily how we apply the pressure. We don't say, hey, if you have a lot of useful, accurate information that you think people need to hear, please share that information. We just say, if you are able to type, or if you have working lips and vocal cords and lungs, get on the internet and start talking. Pressuring people to speak about something before they're ready to speak about something, people who maybe never should be speaking about a certain thing, is not going to result in the most useful, the most helpful, the best, most quality information being disseminated and shared. That kind of social pressure with that kind of incomplete messaging is how you wind up with a lot of misinformation being shared and accepted by a lot of people. It's how you wind up with a lot of posts that start to feel like this.
Hey guys, I just wanted to hop on here, and then I'm literally throwing my phone in the garbage can. But I just wanted to hop on here and take a second to say that what we are not going to do, ladies and gentlemen, theys and thems, what we are not going to do is stigmatize. Okay? What we're not going to do, let me say that again for the people in the back. What we're not going to do is stigmatize.
It's very similar to the way that Americans put social pressure on each other to vote. Our messaging is always just, you should vote. Voting is the right thing to do. If you don't vote, you're a bad person. Vote no matter what your level of education is, just get out and vote. Like, if you're being honest with yourself, you don't just want more people voting no matter what, or no matter who they're voting for. You want more people voting specifically for the things that you're hoping to get out of an election. But we never say it like that. We don't say, hey, definitely turn up to vote if you're planning on voting for the things that I want you to vote for. But if you're not planning on voting for those things, stay home. And likewise, we also don't message it that way when we're trying to apply social pressure for people to speak up in a given situation that's going on in the world. We just say speak up no matter what, just like we say vote no matter what, even though we know that people like this are out there voting.
The sun at any given time, and when you say the sun, there is no the sun. Everybody has their own sun.
What do you mean?
Literally.
What do you mean literally?
Literally, everybody has their own sun. There's a different sun for everybody.
What do you mean a different
Everywhere.
sun? I don't understand that. Like, you mean you're saying that there's a different sun here in Las Vegas than there is in New York?
You're not looking at the same sun there, correct?
So how many suns are there?
As many people who are viewing it.
Okay, that was my little added section. Back to the original stuff.
Like in that last video, he questions why he isn't seeing as much full-throated, passionate support for Palestinian freedom as he thinks he ought to be seeing. I have to admit that when I see everyone calling out and condemning the silence on their timelines, I kind of have a hard time relating to it, because my timeline is anything but silent. I obviously can't say what your feed looks like, but my internet is currently loaded top to bottom on every single platform with content about Israel and Palestine. I can't scroll 3 posts without seeing something about it. So when people say that they can't believe how quiet everyone is being, I'm not exactly sure what they mean. Maybe they just have a slightly less politically motivated algorithm than I do. I don't know. But also, it sort of feels like a lot of people are just now in the year 2023 becoming aware of this conflict. And, you know, I think that's a good thing. A lot of people seem to be, for the first time, discovering the truths about the horrific erasure of the Palestinian people and the callous cruelty of Israel's Zionistic occupation. And that's good. More people being aware and having accurate information is a good thing. But I can't help but feel like, where the hell has everyone been this whole fucking time? I'm almost 36 years old, and this conflict has been happening my entire life. People have been talking about this my entire life. It has always been a topic of discussion. I know I'm giving you my personal anecdotal perspective on this. I understand that some of you may just be learning about this for the first time and feeling genuine shock that you hadn't heard more about it before, but I just don't really relate to that or understand how that's possible. I don't really get how anyone who's been alive for the last 50 years could get the idea that not enough people are talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It sort of feels like somebody watched one of the Disney Plus Star Wars shows and it was the first piece of Star Wars content they ever saw, and they got on the internet and they were like, how come no one's talking about Star Wars? Star Wars is amazing. More people should be talking about Star Wars. And it's just sort of like, what? We have been. It's for so long now. We are talking about Star Wars, and we have been talking about Star Wars. And so that's also one of the things that informs why, to me, it is complex and not simple. People have been heavily debating this for a very long time, passionately invested in this cause and trying desperately to find a workable solution to no avail. And I don't know, it feels kind of massively arrogant for a bunch of Americans who seem to somehow just be discovering this conflict for the first time to enter the chat 50 years deep into the narrative with a quick hot take on why it's actually super simple and how it can be easily resolved. I do like that this guy acknowledges that it seems simple to him, but that there is an emotional component he is fundamentally detached from that might add a little more complexity to it. I appreciated that dose of self-aware nuance. And I'm only telling you all of this because if you're frustrated that certain friends of yours or content creators that you follow aren't offering an adequate level of support or awareness to this conversation, this might be why. And by this, I mean everything I've said in this entire video. The person you're waiting on to speak up might be struggling with complex philosophical dilemmas and a fear of social retribution if they represent the issue as complicated and not simple. The person whose silence you are currently criticizing might just feel acutely aware of their own emotional ignorance on the topic and feel hesitant to loudly and publicly state an opinion as a result. Or maybe the person you think should be saying more isn't, because they feel the same overwhelming helplessness and powerlessness that you feel, only it's manifesting in a different way. Maybe your feeling of powerlessness manifests in a Hail Mary pass, desperately trying anything, sharing any video, any link to any petition, anything you can try to do to have even the slightest effect on this situation that feels so impossibly big. And maybe that same feeling of powerlessness in your friend results in a sort of catatonic paralysis. Maybe your friend feels like nothing they could possibly do could actually affect this conflict in any meaningful way, and that the only real motivation they have for posting something is to performatively placate the people on their timeline who are daily pressuring them to post something. I don't often use the term virtue signaling, but I can tell you honestly that from where I'm sitting, that's what a lot of our online discourse around this topic winds up feeling like to me. I get it, I promise, I really do. We feel powerless and helpless and scared, and taking any kind of action has a self-soothing effect that maybe offers some semblance of control and safety. I think that's why a lot of us are participating in this online discourse, not because we actually believe we stand a shot at moving the needle on this decades-long conflict that we lack fundamental emotional proximity to, but because we're afraid. We're afraid of being misunderstood. We're afraid of being accused of saying the wrong things or not saying enough or hijacking a tragedy and inserting ourselves into something that isn't our business or just being a bad person. And those are all very human and relatable fears. The problem is, if that's what's motivating our online discourse, then we aren't really doing any of it for the people involved in the conflict, so much as we're doing it for each other, to signal to each other that we are good people doing the right things and holding the right beliefs. And that's kind of the definition of performative activism and virtue signaling. which is why I can't help but get the vague sense that a lot of the advocacy I'm currently seeing on my timeline looks and feels like this.
Because when we as people, when we stigmatize each other, it's loud. Okay? The stigmatization is deafening, and that is not what we're going to do. No, we are going to, as a people, not stigmatize. We're not stigmatizing, okay? Stigmatization is something we're not going to be doing to each other. And for me, if I see one more person stigmatizing, I'm gonna fucking lose it.
So yeah, this is it. This is my video on the great Palestinian-Israeli conflict of the late 20th and early 21st century. I did my best to accurately and thoroughly explain my feelings, but I'm not really hopeful or confident that I'm going to change many minds. This video, these words, this approach, this feels more honest for me, more complete. At least for right now, this feels like the closest I'm going to get to accurately offering an explanation for why I do the things I do, why I advocate for the causes I advocate for, and why I find this particular issue to be anything but simple. Once again, for the benefit of anyone who maybe forgot, I'll close this very long video by restating my general beliefs and opinions on this matter. I want full freedom and rights for the Palestinian people, and an end to Israel's genocidal Zionistic occupation of Palestinian territory. The finer details of how all that can be feasibly and practically achieved are above my pay grade. My sympathy and compassion is offered without reserve to the innocent victims of this conflict, both Palestinian and Israeli, without preference or ranking. My most sincere desire is for a complete ceasefire and a functional peace to be achieved in the region.